You're listening to Chicago Stories, a new podcast from City Hall featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans as told to Mayor Rami Emanuel.
Mayor Rami Emanuel, Chicago Stories, with Rami Nashashibi from Iman. Did I get that all right?
That's right.
I know a lot of people want to ask you about the MacArthur Genius Award. I want to start with really what's pressing. Mm-hmm. What's it like growing up with the name Rami? No.
With Rami?
I think nobody else can really ask you that question, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because for a long time, anyone who asked me Rami, it'd be I'd say Rami, what? Rami, Ronaldo, Roberto,
I get
Robert,
right?
Yeah. But okay, then you got into the mix.
I said I made your life easier.
Well, a little more difficult, easy. No, then it was like, oh, Ram, no, not that guy. Rami.
Yeah.
And then there was a while when we had a presidential candidate, right? Romney. So at a certain point, I was being introduced as Romney.
Okay. Well, it's
So since Senator Durbin met me, he's like, you must be you're the Rami or the Ram of
right.
63rd.
I was always Ram, except for if my father being affectionate.
Yeah.
It was Rami.
Oh, really?
So my father, Ram, but if he was being affectionate about wanting me to listen a little more, yeah, he would call me Rami.
Yeah.
My mother still calls me, regardless of mood swing, Rami.
It's an interesting name because it's actually, you can find it among Israelis, Arabs, Persians, Iranians.
Persians, I did not.
They have a Ramin. They have a Ramin. I don't know if I think there's I think there's Rami that means a person with good aim. I don't know the Hebrew Ram comes from Rahma, I think, right?
Right, but it comes from the back end of Abraham.
Yeah.
And it means power or powerful. I know everybody wants the genius stuff. I want to go with like, what's it like growing up with Rami, man?
Yeah. Well, you just have to accept it, and you would have to tell. You just got to try to roll with it. Yeah.
Doesn't everybody want to run for office with the name Rami Emanuel?
And then try Rami Nashashibi, and is that Japanese? Is that, so they just gave me a proclamation yesterday at Cook County, and that poor woman at the Cook County had to read, whereas Rami, by the time she got to the 22nd whereas, she was just saying it so quietly because I think she just felt so bad.
It is tough on people. They kind of like don't get it when you always meet people and then they always go, what's the name? I mean, give me, they look at me and do that explanation. Now your family, we have one other connection, but I want to work our way in there.
Sure.
Your family, what's your journey to Chicago? How is that?
It's fascinating because last week I took my grandfather, not even last week, maybe 4 or 5 days ago, and I sent out a picture of him. I said, now he's the real genius. He's 91 years old.
So the age of my father.
And we went to celebrate at Giordano's on 63rd and Cicero in front of the airport that my grandfather came to this country to work in 1952. Now,
he came to work at Midway.
He was working in Midway in 1952. Now, my grandfather doesn't have more than a 6th grade education. Refugee of 1948. He in a village that's still intact in Jerusalem, Ein Kerem, you may know.
Yeah, I know.
It's a hip trend. It's kind of hipster village now outside Jerusalem. And when they left, he, during the time of the British mandate of Palestine, was just a kid who was obsessed with, airplanes, and managed to kind of get a trick or two from some of the airplane mechanics. And he just learned on his own, and he became an aviation mechanic. And so he came and did that in Jordan, and then came to Chicago. Now my grandmother,
post 48, 52,
came 52. Now here's the interesting thing though, my grandmother, who's also still alive, her father came to Chicago in like 1923.
That's kind of like,
and he was back and forth on boats, back and forth to Palestine and Chicago. So the reason my grandfather even came to Chicago, I said, why'd you come to Chicago? He said, well, your grandmother had connections in Chicago. And that was through her we have family that fought in the Korean War. We have family that's kind of been in the city literally since the early 20th century. And the interesting thing is that my grandfather's first house was on 67th and Stony, second house was on 65th and Stewart, and then they moved their way into Marquette Park.
But I mean, I kind of know the history of the Jewish migration to Chicago. There must be a larger migration than of Palestinians and
Arabs and Lebanese. Yeah, I mean, there's an extraordinary overlap, honestly, with some of the migratory patterns. Obviously, there was a sector of the Jewish community that was coming out of Poland and was coming out of Eastern Europe. But there was also a Sephardic Jewish migration, right? And that kind of parallels some of the journeys that some of those older Arabs and Palestinians and Jordanians and kind of the people of the Levant, as they were called at the time.
And then if you go just outside the city to the southwestern suburbs, heavy Muslim Arab and Muslim population.
And now that history is also a fascinating one in the city, because at that point, remember, as you know well, right, King comes into Marquette Park in '66. At that time, at that time, my mom was probably one of the first and only Arab American families in and around the area. And a decade later, it's still, the Nazis were rallying in the park. The Nazis had set up their headquarters right there on 71st and Rockwell. Yeah, and I know your story. You were a Dragons kid when you were there in '78, and at that time, then you begin to see the '80s come around, and by the time the late '80s happened, then you really begin to see more and more Latinos who were coming up from Little Village and Pilsen. Finally, kind of the black families were able to push through that invisible barrier right off Western.
Sometimes invisible, sometimes not invisible.
Not so invisible, and most every black family in and around the larger Marquette Park can talk to you about that brick. Right. There was at least one brick that went through one window when they were the only black or second black family on the block. And then, Arab families started coming in part, the Intifada created a big migration, in part the Gulf War created a second larger wave. And so you started seeing a groundswell of Arab and Palestinian families in around the 63rd area. And they were there, and so for a while, Marquette Park, like the mid-90s, was really one of the most diverse kind of working class parts of the city.
Of all working class.
And a pretty intense working class, working poor part of the community.
So here, I always, for me, because I remember when the neo-Nazis were going to march in Skokie, and when the court ruled, they said, okay, we're going to go to Marquette Park. And I told my dad, we're going to go to Marquette Park, and he said, why? And I said, because it doesn't matter where they are, just because they're not in your background. And that was my first, even though I grew up with a politically conscious, socially conscious home, that was my first independent decision. I was going to take a political statement on my own at Marquette Park. What would be the point of inflection for the grandson of a aviation mechanic? When do you make your own independent decision? And obviously you had diplomatic.
Well, my father,
right?
Yeah.
So when is your awareness, your first conscious decision, you're going to take a step on your own?
I'll tell you one of the most formative.
And how does it lead to Marquette Park?
Yeah, I'll tell you one of the most formative moments in my life. Now, interestingly, most of my young adult life, I was outside of the United States. Chicago always remained the symbolic home for me in the United States because of my mom's connection. But
so stories around the table.
My mom was always talking about Chicago, and at heart, my mom was a South Side girl. She was born in outside of Jerusalem, outside of Bethlehem, in fact. But her 6 siblings, or 5 siblings, all are brought up on the Southwest Side, and they're very kind of typical. Their all names go from Suad to Sue, Imad to Joey. Till today, it's hard for me not to call him Uncle Joey, because that's the guy he grew up with. And they were South Side toughs, growing up among Irish and Polish and other kind of kids on the Southwest Side, Italian kids. But my father was a different story. He comes from a very Nashashibi. Anyone, whether they're Israeli or Palestinian, the first thing I do whenever I enter back into that part of the world, an Israeli would love to give me history about my family's name, because they know Nashashibi right away identifies me as a Jerusalem family. My father's family has deep roots in the city of Jerusalem. Goes back to the time of Salahuddin Ayyubi.
So they have the Arab quarter.
They're there in the airport. They're there on Sheikh Jarrah. They have like land. My grandfather was a pretty significant person. I never met him.
You know how many lines and threads you and I have?
I'm sure.
Yeah, we're going to add 30 minutes to this show alone, man.
Well, let me tell you.
We may not even get out of kindergarten by the time we're done.
Well, I'll tell you one of the most interesting formative moments for me. So it's 1983 or 82. Yeah. Summer 82. I'm like now 10 years old. My brother is around 7 or 8. Now my mom, we had been back and forth visiting relatives in the West Bank. We were in Jordan at the time. So I grew up, like I said, Jordan, Spain, Romania, a bunch of different places.
Yeah, let's just say you were a wandering Jew.
I was a wandering Jew, right? A wandering Palestinian Jew kind of guy.
A brother from the Mideast.
Right. And so my mom decides, my parents had divorced at this point. I had a real bad divorce, and my dad, diplomatic lifestyle, a whole bunch of things. So it got real messy. My mom marries, interestingly enough, and kind of to just add intensity to my world, a Marine, a U.S. Marine from Indiana who converts to Islam, about to marry my mother, who was stationed over there. And so that's another chapter of my life. But I'm with my mom.
Every time you say something, I'm adding 20 minutes to this interview. But keep going.
At that point, though, my mom decides to take us to visit relatives in Ramallah and Jerusalem. Now, I think I had been there before, but this was the most definitive moment. It was not long after the invasion into Lebanon, and so there were some really dramatic moments, including the massacre in these 2 refugee camps called Shatil and Sabra. Any Palestinian who saw that, and we saw that, and it was horrific, and so we were already with that in the back of our heads. But we're going over the bridge, and this is the Allenby Bridge. The Allenby Bridge.
I know it.
And now, the minute you go over the Allenby Bridge, we're on the bus with the foreigners because we all got American passports. And I'm thinking, this is kind of good. We're the only, this is feeling good. I'm looking outside the window and I see literally hundreds of people who are lined up on the other side. And I'm asking my mom, who are they? They're like, well, those are the Arabs and others with Arab passport. I'm like, man, I'm glad I got this big blue. I already at 10, I'm seeing the privilege of being able to have this American passport. But it wasn't until then I went into the station, and then all of a sudden, though, our American passport and citizenship really didn't mean much. Rami Nashashibi and Kareem Nashashibi, back of the station. So we waited and watched everyone process. And then an Israeli soldier came up and said to my mom, we have to take them. And she says, again, my mom's a South Side girl at heart.
You're not messing with the
F no, you are not taking my children.
You're not, don't mess with the cubs in front of the mama bear.
And they said, sorry, man, we got to take them to, and she's taking where? They take them to be strip searched. And so this was a traumatic moment. Soldiers eventually did take my brother and I, and we were, stripped down our underwear, and I'm hearing my mom. So that in itself was traumatic to experience that and try to calm my brother. And I'm hearing my mom's voice throughout the station screaming at the top of her lungs. That was traumatic. And I came back, and it was finally when we came back, I'll never forget, it was a young Sephardic Israeli soldier from Yemen who was trying to comfort my mom, and it was confusing, so it kind of gave me talking to her in Arabic, English and Arabic, because my mom's, again, speaking English to people, but it was a complicated picture of a very oppressive situation, and I saw that, and I felt that. I think that stuck with me as a kid. It stuck with me in a number of reasons. Number one, I felt the disparities, the distinctions of certain people and others. I felt the fear. I grew up fearful of Jewish people after that for a while. Now I have a very good relationship with the Jewish community in Chicago, and I speak often in synagogues. And sometimes I get asked, did you grow up hating Jews? And I try to explain, no, I actually grew up fearful for a long time.
It's an interesting...
and part of it was the kind of the trauma of that moment, and that my only interaction at that point. That was the first time I saw a military.
It's interesting because it is the time that you're saying you had the big blue, and you realize that you assume certain benefits.
Right.
And it's very easy those benefits to be stripped away, and then you're something more raw.
You're something more raw, right? And you begin to realize what other people really go through, right? And And I felt that. Fast forward from that moment back until I came back to Chicago as a kid trying to come to college, and I had come, the last country I was in Italy. And I immediately plunged, because at this point, racial disparities, different parts of neighborhoods, that wasn't part of my reality. But I immediately found myself drawn into that reality, trying to understand the experiences of particularly, the larger African American experience was one that was really resonant with me, because although I was a kid not brought up here, I was already infected with hip hop culture, and that was my point of reference. And an identification with the story of oppression. And I came here and I started really trying to figure all of that out. And eventually it led to one summer, I was very active as a student. One summer, headed to Cabrini Green to get involved, and I got a call from a woman I love, and she named Camille O'Day, who set up a lot of work on the Southwest side. She said, Rami, we heard about you and some of your activism. There's we hear you're going to Cabrini Green, but they got tons of stuff there. There's some real things jumping off here at 63rd. Kids in gangs, Arab kids in communities, both Black, Latino, and Arab, and there's no one really here to address it. We have a CDBG grant, run a summer program, we're looking for someone, would you come down? And that really became the entree. So I kind of ironically come back to the neighborhood that my mom kind of grew up in.
I make a joke sometimes, my grandfather, when he came here 100 years ago, North Lawndale, met my grandmother at a dance at Douglas Park. When he thought he made it, he had moved to Albany Park. My uncle was a sergeant in Albany Park. My dad's medical practice when he starts is Albany Park. I become a congressman. I said, we travel many miles, we just haven't gone very far. And that is... You find this really this really kind of just otherworldly way in which you just circle back to places where you come from. Marquette Park has an emotional pull on you.
It does, it's interesting because that...
It has an emotional pull on the city.
Yeah, and I think it's, it's such a profound symbol of not just a meta-narrative in the city, but in the country. And
well, that's because I don't want to put words in your mouth. If it wasn't for Dr. King's presence there, with the reflection, it's not a Southern problem, it's an American problem.
It's an American problem,
and that's Marquette Park.
And it's and to remind us that the wounds, the racial wounds, and are so deep that we haven't had an opportunity to really heal from all of those things. And what I learned in the process of this extraordinary thing that we're part of last year to commemorate the 50th anniversary of King's March in Marquette Park, build the memorial there. It was really, those wounds, those opportunities to not only address the wounds, but also to begin to address the healing process. The healing process hasn't really fully happened, and I'll never forget, I was in the 8th District.
Do you think it can?
What's that?
Do you think it can?
I always, and this is, I guess, a fundamental spiritual conviction. Yeah, I think it can, and I've seen it. I've seen it happen.
Can I ask? I struggle with this, so I'm interested in your perspective.
Yeah,
I've read a little, and you kind of come later in life to the role of religion in civic life.
Yeah,
you don't start there, but you.
Not at all.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, not at all.
I grew up. If you got what I would say. I grew up in a Jewish home that was, being a Democrat was one of the, lost tribes, okay?
Right.
And my parents were adamant, given American history and Jewish history, separation of church and state, real separate.
Of course.
But I have later in life become not just more and more religious and spiritual, but trying to say, while there is a separation, that civic life, civic life, the life we know, which I actually think is more under threat, can only survive drawing on the strength of the spiritual. But how do you make sure it doesn't become and I don't know if I'm articulating this well, one dominant religion at the depression of others. So how do you struggle? Maybe you don't struggle with that. Well, the separation of church and state, or the separation of spiritual from secular, probably is a better, not civic.
It's interesting, and because I grew up in such a religious household, and because religion was never even a consideration for me. I mean, in fact, I was just one of those people that found, I'd spent some time in Italy. I found, there's nothing really attractive to me there about Catholicism in that representation. Although I found the beauty in the architecture. I spent some time in Saudi Arabia as a kid, and that doesn't work. That pushed me away. And and then I thought, like every 18-year-old kid, thought you knew everything you need to know. And the reality is I had never opened up any one religious text. I had never opened up any of them. And so I undergo this really intense spiritual education, quite frankly. And I still am on a very intense spiritual journey, but I think the engagement I had with the Muslim cultural and spiritual tradition opened me up eventually to all different traditions, where I really begin to see a holistic engagement that doesn't require such a refined demarcation. In other words, I think the public, political, civic life that we've had in the United States, for instance, has always been animated by some really strong spiritual convictions. And when spirituality and religion at its best, it kind of works in that kind of aspirational agitation space that challenges us to live up to the unfulfilled ideals in our spiritual traditions. So for instance, Rabbi Marx, who is a great mentor of mine, and one of the people I first called, in fact, in that morning when I was, but when it became public, there was like a list of 10 people that I wanted to make sure heard from me before they heard from the media, and Rabbi Marx was one of them. And
this is when you got the Genius Award.
The Genius Award, right? And what always animated, what I always found extraordinarily powerful about him and his interpretation of spiritual life that eventually morphed into the formation of the JCUA and extraordinary kind of Jewish American activism around social justice issues in Chicago, which educated me, by the way, and helped to really reorient me in terms of the way I even thought about the Jewish tradition. Because at that point, again, I was a kid who, by virtue of my Palestinian background, only knew of one manifestation of Jewish life, and that was very militarized in the context of the West Bank and what I saw there. But here, now I'm encountering this whole different tradition. And one thing that Rabbi Marx did on that, when he was assigned to be a neutral observer on August 5th, 1966, by a congregation of synagogues, he writes this profound 2.5-page letter to all of the congregates saying, I can't be a neutral observer. And everything I've read in the rabbinical text and everything I've read in the Hebrew Bible and everything I've thought about in terms of what it means to be a Jew,
the prophets,
right, of a prophetic life and prophetic calling, demands that I take a side. And it was that articulation of spirituality, I think, that resonates with me and it gives me hope. It's a spirituality that's not about just calling others out. It's a spirituality that does call out injustice, but it's a spirituality that invites introspection, that says we're all in this together. It's not about a bunch of us and thems.
I think, well, it's interesting. See, you're calling on the Jewish, and it doesn't mean it's limited to Jewish, but the social activism of facing injustice and righting in this world, the Tikkun Olam, healing the world.
Healing the world, yeah.
But I see, for me, I think religion at its best in informing secular civic life is creating a community not based on blood or ethnicity, but ideas and values. And that sense of community. And I actually find, I'm just saying for me, while you can believe in a separation and a firm demarcation because of the history of how Protestants treated Catholics, et cetera, and the history of the country, that religious spiritual life is best in informing civic secular life when it's able to instruct on how to create community. And that to me...
I think so. And I don't think, and again, there is a history and a genealogy for why demarcation is so important in the larger political American context. And why it's so extraordinarily almost, it's almost a religion in and of itself in places like France for their histories. In the United States, though, when you start looking at, for instance, the great social reformist movements, they were all
Transcendentalist, Dr. King.
When you start talking about the suffragettes, you're talking about prohibition. When you start talking about civil rights, they're profoundly animated by spiritual conviction that didn't see a division between cultural, political, social,
secular.
Artistic. That just didn't exist. And it wasn't about imposing a particular religious dogma on another group of people.
Moral suasion.
It was about moral persuasion. It was about moral authority. It was about agitation in the best way possible. And I think on some level, that's what is the aspirational ideal in America that I think makes our experience still hopeful in the light of even very maybe dark and challenging times.
Very dark and challenging times. Let me ask you, you said 10 people, so you gave me one. Who are the other 9 people that you had to call first before anybody else calls them?
Well, my mother was one of them.
Okay.
Although she didn't quite know this. My mother and my grandfather.
Your mother said, I always knew you were a genius. What are you telling me?
My mother helps to put me kind of, you know, don't.
So mom.
So mom.
Rabbi Marks.
So Rabbi Marks. There were Deborah Harrington. She was the first president of the Woods Fund, who really kind of believed in us. Camille O'Day, the woman that brought me to 63rd Street, which was interesting because it was the anniversary of her husband's death, and we talked about how significant the overlap of that was. There's a number of younger people that were really a critical part of the work early on, that really were formative in my life trajectory, in my history, in the way I thought about things. The one person I reach out to who's been an extraordinary influence in my life is a guy by the name of Kenny Gamble in South Philly, who, you know, just one of these pioneering, you know, people who know him from the Gamble and Huff era. They produced more gold and platinum hits, but he also led perhaps one of the most dynamic urban transformation projects I've seen in the country. And even when I was just up and coming and not doing much of anything, he was very humble in taking us under his wing and showing me around and mentoring me. So it was people like that who've served as kind of mothers, second mothers, third mothers in my life, mentors, and people who I'm just, I always say, I mean, I'm just a very privileged beneficiary of, you know, tremendous legacy of activism and organizing and agitation in the most healthy way. And I've come to appreciate agitation in a healthy way, importantly, internally. And I think there's a way in which we can have, and I think unfortunately so much of our conflict now in this country, whether it's locally, whether it's cross country, is sometimes direct confrontation with no hope that we can bring each other collectively to a higher ground. And you know, I think that's again our spiritual traditions and the mentors that I've had have taught me that the latter is possible and have demonstrated how that type of change is possible.
Was the agitation the kind of Saul Alinsky thread?
I think Saul Alinsky is part of it. I've grown to appreciate Alinsky, you know, as part of the larger organizing tradition in our city. I think part of it is the spiritual agitation that we get from the minbar, or we get from the podium, or we get from the synagogue and the temple. That agitation that says, you know, what we profess, our professed ideals and lived realities, right? We must be alive to the gap between those things.
No, agitating towards, you think, the shortcomings of reality versus the shortcomings of the ideals that you would profess to live by.
And be alive to that. And how do we not only become alive to it, but then challenge ourselves in our neighborhoods, in the city, in the country, to commit ourselves to shortening that gap.
Do you want to take your work past Marquette Park?
Well, it's already definitely past Marquette Park. I mean, you know, we do a lot of citywide stuff. We're very invested in Inglewood. We've been historically doing citywide, you know, statewide legislation, and now we have a full-time chapter in Atlanta. And you know, and in many instances, we're being called on to think about models and best practices in other urban centers across the country.
What is some of the guidance you think we should be doing? What do you see in Inglewood as? Because I actually think there's a possibility that Inglewood can be at an inflection point.
I think part of what I hope comes out, there's such extraordinary dynamism in Inglewood, and Eman had always had a large base in Inglewood and Southeast Side and South Shore and even in the Kenwood area. So we've always kind of floated among those spaces. I think there's a lot of phenomenal leadership in Inglewood. I think there's a lot of commitment there. I think part of our secret to rehabilitating these communities in a way that doesn't displace others or does so in a way that has equity is to make sure that we begin to not, you know, isolate ourselves from one another. Inglewood can't be isolated from Marquette Park. Marquette Park can't be isolated from Little Village. We can't have these neighborhood plans that don't look at the totality. You think about part of the success of the North Side and many of the villages in and around these neighborhoods is that, you know, a person doesn't really think, okay, I'm in Lincoln Park now, I'm in Edgewater. I'm as comfortable being and going to a restaurant in Lincoln Park as I am going to Edgewater. And there's a type of flow that exists that historically has not existed for structural, for races, for other reasons about I'm a Latino, I don't go to this neighborhood. I'm a black person, I don't go to this neighborhood. We still need to break down both the psychological barriers that we built out that allow us to feel the flow. You know, I ride a bike a lot, so I'm riding through the neighborhoods a lot, and you know,
it's a whole different perspective.
You get a whole different perspective
from a car.
And you begin to feel like, where is the flow? And there are times where I'm the only bike rider in miles, right? And I'm thinking, how different would it be if people felt more comfortable flowing through these communities, from Market Park into Inglewood, from Inglewood into Little Village, from Little Village into these other neighborhoods, and how do we create that type of ability? You know, Halloween's coming up, and you know, one thing is always it's one of the most depressing things would see a young brother in Inglewood and with his family trying to go trick-or-treating off 4 or 5 blocks of, you know, block after block of criminal disinvestment. And
see, it's interesting. Well, my view, and I don't know if you may or may not share this, it is not a tale of two cities so much as a tale of two choices. One side was invested, the other was not invested. And we have to invest. And you're talking about the flow between. Doesn't mean you agree with it. I'm just telling you that is a perspective of investing. And what Englewood's an example, Pullman, where I was this week, making these investments to create the threads of a community that we as a city can appreciate a community with a history like Pullman, but not have a distinction that you're leaving one neighborhood to come to another. As you said, there's a flow to it, there's an ease to it that doesn't exist, whether you're going from Little Village to a Marquette Park.
Right. I think those choices are really important to delineate, you know, how they exist in different spaces. Historically, those choices were about the very lived reality of segregation, right, and restricted covenants and redlining, and so it's not as if a black family really had much of a choice. And it's not as even white working class folks, and this is why it's important that they understand their history, they were as victimized by the scapegoating, the fear mongering as anyone else. I mean, if you look at, it's a great sociological piece that really helps chronicle the work of how did these extraordinarily beautiful blocks and 85-90% white go like from 90-85% white to 85-90% black within a decade. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't just a bunch of random choices. It was, you know, look, people were redlining. People were making a lot of money off this. They were, you know, there were reports of even getting young black kids to ride a bike up and down a block and go to that poor Lithuanian family that just invested their entire life resources into the home and say, in 2 weeks' time, there's going to be more of little Johnny and his family coming in. The value of your home is going to drop to 50% if you're lucky. We'll give you 70% right now and call it even. And they did that until they pushed all of those families into areas like Marquette Park. And by that point, they were sick of being pushed west. And they were, again, the worst of their sentiments were whipped up into fear. And it's important to be honest about that history, because it's why you and I were just talking about why Marquette Park is such an important symbol, because it's not unlike the narrative that you see happening across the country today.
So, well, it's across, I would say, you know, what's your favorite city? You would say Palestine, but in Israel, what would you say is your favorite city there?
Oh, without question, the old city of Jerusalem.
I love Jaffa. I think Jaffa is one of the great cities.
And you know, I haven't been there. I haven't been to Jaffa.
Well, there's Jerusalem, old city of Jerusalem. There's no other city in the world like it. And I always tell, and when you walk around, all the different smells and all the different flavors and all the different cultures that all come, because the world does descend on Jerusalem. And the beauty, I think, of parts of Chicago, and you can see it in a neighborhood like Pilsen and other areas, is when it all comes together and people respect people's differences, but yet have something they share together. That's what I think that's, the truth is, Ram and Rami can say, no, you can't. That's what makes Chicago really unique.
It's true. I think we embrace the dynamism of the city by also embracing the real hardship and challenges that the city's
Without
have.
it, you can't run away from it.
You can't run away from it, and that's what makes Chicago, Chicago, and that's why I think even people who've had a love-hate relationship love the city, love the narrative of the city. It's the Lorraine, it's Raisin in the Sun, it's Native Son, it's all of that larger legacy. It
has a pull on you.
It has a pull on you. It's, listen, one of the first sociological pieces I read was Louis Worth's The Ghetto. It's perhaps the first Jewish American sociologist out of University of Chicago that writes the most expansive evolution of spaces that were also about conflict. But I think there's hope when we're honest about the stuff that's difficult, whether it's about police, relationships, whether it's honest about equitable, community development, when we're honest about public education. We're not afraid of those conversations, and we bring them in with a vision towards healing and kind of equity.
The last part I would say is, if we can be honest and then also not accusatory, but how to fix them.
Yeah.
The reason nobody faces honesty is it's done with an accusatory, who do we blame for this, rather than how do we fix this.
Yeah.
There's a big difference in attitude and dealing with honesty.
I call it the process, and again, this is partly this, if we're true to our spiritual convictions and we all realize that, hey, we all got a lot to work on with ourselves, but there's the calling out, which is important. I don't want to diminish. We need to call out things for what they are and be honest in that process. But if you just stop there, that doesn't help anyone. Like if I'm just calling out my interpretation of injustice in this capacity or there, okay, you've done a phenomenal analysis of the injustice and we need to be honest about that, but then we need to call up. And for me, it's not just about calling out. So it's, the work is calling out, but calling up, lifting up. How do we lift up an aspirational ideal? How do we lift up a pathway towards that ideal that is real, that is concrete, that's about jobs, that's about opportunity, that's about economic development, that's about really giving the young brother education, giving the young brother, I literally just came, the day I got this extraordinary announcement, that very night I was back in a home on the south side with a kid with a bullet in his stomach who had just been shot by his partner in a drug transaction, and with the realization that everything I've had in my life, he was telling me, has failed me up until this point. And we were trying to guide him towards a pathway towards redemption, a pathway towards healing. I can't just give that kid rhetoric. I can't give him just accusatory, well, you're here because of X, Y, and Z. I need to give that young brother a meaningful pathway out of the mess that he was in and that we all are in collectively if we don't deal with that solution.
I don't know whether you agree with this, but I always say if you don't give anybody any choices, they'll make that choice.
Yeah.
That's what will happen.
Yeah.
I want to have you back to talk about.
I would love to have this conversation.
First of all, as we would say in the old country, mazel tov.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No, I'm serious about that.
I appreciate that.
I got a set of questions since we're talking about Chicago.
Yeah.
Deep dish or thin?
Thin. That's my old school Italian exposure.
It's okay.
Yeah.
River, lake? It's not a trick question. You don't get graded.
I know. It depends. I love the lake. I love the lake.
Cub socks?
Socks, definitely.
I knew that. That was like
definitely.
a throw. That was a throwaway.
Yeah.
16-inch, 12-inch?
I would go with the 16.
Okay. Hancock, Willis Tower? I should say, let's stick with the old school. Hancock,
Sears. Yeah. I'll go with Sears.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. This is Chicago Stories.
Yeah.
Congratulations, man. We're really proud of you.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
You have been listening to Chicago Stories, a new podcast from City Hall featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans as told to Mayor Rami Emanuel.